Welcome. Tonight's story is one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking accounts buried in American history. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe, because uncovering stories like this takes an enormous amount of time, checking records, and digging through real historical documents that were never meant to be revisited. This is the true and chilling story of Virginia's most abused enslaved girl, whose desperate escape didn't bring peace. It unleashed one of the darkest revenge stories history ever recorded. She was born into violence long before she understood what pain meant. On the Virginia plantation where she first opened her eyes, cruelty wasn't an exception, it was routine. From the moment she could walk, her body was treated as property, something to be disciplined, controlled, and broken into obedience. The older enslaved women tried to shield her when they could, pulling her behind skirts or whispering warnings when footsteps approached. But protection was temporary and punishment was constant. Even as a child, she learned that silence was survival. Crying only brought worse consequences. The mistress of the house viewed her not as a child, but as a reminder of power. Small mistakes, spilling water, walking too slowly, failing to anticipate an order, were met with lashes, slaps, or days locked in dark storage rooms meant for tools, not people. Hunger became normal. Cold nights without blankets became routine. The girl's body carried marks before she even reached adolescence, scars layered over scars, each one teaching her the same lesson: she did not belong to herself. But the worst abuse didn't come only from punishment. As she grew older, her suffering shifted into something more calculated and more terrifying. Overseers lingered too long. Hands stayed where they didn't belong. She learned to keep her eyes down, her posture small, hoping invisibility might protect her. It didn't. The plantation's silence was thick with secrets, and hers was one of many that were never meant to be spoken aloud. The laws of the time ensured that no crime committed against her could ever truly be called a crime. The enslaved quarters whispered about her at night. Some pitied her, others feared for her. They saw how often she was summoned to the main house, how she returned hours later trembling, barely able to stand. No one asked questions, because questions led to punishment. Even the men who wanted to help knew their own lives hung by a thread. And so, the girl learned that suffering could be public, but pain must remain private. By the time she was barely a teenager, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. Sleep brought no rest, only nightmares of footsteps in hallways and doors creaking open. She stopped expecting kindness. When a traveling preacher once placed a hand on her head and prayed for her soul, she didn't feel comfort. She felt anger. Because prayer never stopped what happened after sunset. God, if he existed, had been silent for far too long. The plantation relied on fear to function, and she became one of its quiet casualties. Her spirit didn't break all at once. It fractured slowly. Each humiliation chipped away at something human inside her. Each act of violence hardened something else. People mistook her quietness for weakness, her obedience for acceptance. They never noticed the way she watched, the way she listened, the way she remembered everything. What made her suffering especially cruel was how ordinary it was. No one considered her abuse exceptional. It was woven into daily life, normalized by routine, excused by law, justified by profit. Even when she fell ill from overwork and neglect, she was forced back into the fields before her body had healed. Pain wasn't a reason to stop. pain was proof that the system was working. Yet, beneath all that suffering, something unexpected survived. Not hope. Hope was too fragile for a place like that. What survived was awareness. She understood the patterns of cruelty. She knew which doors creaked, which floorboards groaned, which people were most dangerous, and which were simply cowards. She learned when to disappear into crowds and when to stand perfectly still. Abuse sharpened her senses. It trained her memory. It taught her patience. There came a moment, small, almost invisible, when something changed inside her. It wasn't the worst beating. It wasn't the worst violation. It was the realization that nothing she did would ever make it stop. Obedience had failed her. Silence had failed her. Endurance had failed her. And in that realization, fear began to loosen its grip. Because when you understand that suffering is endless, the future stops being something to fear. Her abusers believed they were erasing her humanity. In truth, they were forging something far more dangerous, a mind that remembered every cruelty, every face, every voice. While they saw a broken slave girl, they failed to see what was forming beneath the scars, someone who no longer believed in mercy, someone who understood exactly how fragile their power truly was. This was the beginning of her story, not the escape, not the revenge, but the slow, relentless abuse that shaped her into someone history would later fear. Because what the plantation created wasn't obedience. It created a witness. And witnesses, once pushed too far, don't forget, the moment that pushed her toward escape didn't arrive with thunder or screaming. It came quietly, almost cruelly ordinary, which somehow made it worse. By then, she had learned to endure pain without reacting, to swallow fear until it sat heavy in her chest like a stone. But that day, something crossed a line even she hadn't known existed. It began as another routine summons to the main house, delivered in a sharp voice that allowed no refusal. She already knew what that walk meant, the long path across the yard, the eyes that followed her, the way the world seemed to narrow with every step. She had made that walk too many times before. Yet this time, something felt different, heavier, as if the air itself was warning her. Inside, the house was quiet in that unnatural way it always was, clean, polished, and filled with unspoken threats. What happened there was not new, but the aftermath was. When she was finally dismissed, she didn't return to the quarters immediately. Instead, she collapsed behind the smokehouse, shaking so violently she couldn't stand. For the first time, her body refused to obey her will. Breathing hurt, moving hurt, existing hurt. And as she sat there in the dirt, something inside her shifted. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was clarity. A brutal, undeniable understanding that this would never stop. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Not ever. Later that evening, she overheard something she was never meant to hear. Two overseers spoke casually near the barn, their voices low, careless, amused. They talked about her as if she weren't human at all, discussing her future as something already decided, something to be passed around, controlled, disposed of when convenient. One of them laughed and said she'd learn her place soon enough. That laugh did something no beating ever had. It stripped away the last illusion she had been clinging to, the belief that survival alone was enough. In that moment, she understood that staying meant a slow death, one that would take everything from her piece by piece, until there was nothing left to recognize as herself. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on the rough floor of the quarters, listening to the breathing of others, staring into the dark. For the first time, her thoughts didn't circle around endurance or avoidance. They moved forward. She replayed the layout of the plantation in her mind, the paths used at dawn, the direction of the river, the gaps in patrols she had noticed over the years, without ever knowing why she remembered them. She thought about the stories whispered by older enslaved people, about the woods, about following the stars, about places where slave catchers were less likely to go. Those stories had once sounded like fantasies. Now, they felt like instructions. What finally sealed her decision was something small, almost invisible to anyone else. Just before sunrise, a younger girl, barely more than a child, was assigned to work beside her in the fields. The girl looked at her with wide, frightened eyes and asked in a whisper, "Does it ever stop hurting?" The question hit her harder than any blow. She saw herself in that child, the same fear, the same quiet desperation. And she realized that if she stayed, she wasn't just condemning herself. She was silently accepting that this cycle would continue, that another girl would grow up learning the same lessons of pain and silence. That was the moment fear finally lost its power. Escape was dangerous. She knew that. Capture could mean torture or death. But staying meant something worse, erasure. She understood then that escape wasn't about freedom in the way people romanticized it. It wasn't about reaching some distant safe place. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. Even if she died trying, the act itself would be a form of resistance. She began to prepare without telling anyone. Preparation didn't mean gathering supplies. She had nothing to take. It meant watching more closely than ever before. She memorized which dogs were chained and which were loose, which overseer drank too much at night, which paths flooded after rain and which stayed firm. She hid her injuries, forced herself to move normally to avoid drawing attention. To everyone else, she looked the same, quiet, obedient, invisible. Inside, she was already leaving. The final push came days later, sudden and violent. An accusation, false but convenient, was made against her in front of others. The punishment promised was public, designed not just to hurt her, but to terrify everyone watching. As she stood there, listening, she felt something unexpected. Calm. The decision had already been made. There was nothing left to debate. That night would be her last on the plantation, one way or another. When darkness fell, she slipped away not with panic, but with purpose. Every step away from the quarters felt unreal, as if she were walking out of her own life and into something unknown. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Behind her were years of pain, humiliation, and control. Ahead of her was danger, but also the possibility, however small, of reclaiming herself. That single incident didn't just push her to escape. It transformed her. It stripped away obedience, shattered fear, and replaced them with resolve. From that moment on, she was no longer just surviving abuse. She was actively defying it. And what no one on that plantation understood was that her escape wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something far more unsettling. Because when someone who has endured that much pain finally chooses action over silence, they don't run blindly. They remember everything. Her disappearance didn't just unsettle the plantation, it cracked it open. At first, the owners treated her escape as an inconvenience, an embarrassment they believed could be quietly corrected. Notices were sent out. Riders were dispatched. Dogs were prepared. But as days passed and she wasn't found, Something far more dangerous than fear began to spread attention. People started asking questions, not just about where she had gone, but about why she would risk everything to leave. The enslaved quarters changed almost immediately. Whispers replaced routine. People began to talk in fragments about late night summons, about punishments that never made it into any ledger, about injuries that were explained away as accidents. Her absence became a mirror, forcing others to look at what had always been hidden in plain sight. The plantation's order depended on silence, and that silence had been broken. The mistress noticed it first. Work slowed. People avoided eye contact. Some refused to enter the main house at all. She demanded explanations, but received only lowered heads and empty responses. The girl's escape had unsettled the unspoken agreement that suffering would remain invisible. And invisibility was the foundation of everything. Then came the unexpected visitors. A distant relative arrived unannounced, claiming concern over rumors. A neighboring landowner sent a letter asking questions that felt too specific to be coincidence. Even the local preacher, who had once spoken gently of obedience and patience, began asking why a young girl would flee rather than endure. Each inquiry tightened the noose. What began to surface wasn't a single crime, but a pattern. Missing records. Punishment logs that didn't match visible injuries. Births that were never recorded. Children who appeared briefly and then vanished from memory. People started connecting dots they had been trained not to see. The overseer who drank too much and lost his temper. The locked rooms no one was allowed to clean. The nights when the house lights stayed on long after everyone else was asleep. Her escape forced these details into the open, because it removed the most convenient lie of all, that the enslaved accepted their condition. If she had endured years of abuse and still chose to run, then endurance was no longer proof of consent. It was proof of fear. The master responded with anger, then panic. He ordered tighter control, harsher discipline, thinking force could restore order. Instead, it did the opposite. Increased cruelty only confirmed the rumors. People noticed injuries appearing on others who had never been punished before, as if someone was trying to silence witnesses before they spoke. That urgency didn't go unnoticed. Even among white families nearby, the mood shifted. Quiet warnings were exchanged. Mothers stopped allowing their children to visit the plantation. Business arrangements cooled. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that something dangerous had been exposed. Not just a runaway slave, but a household that could no longer hide what it was. The most damaging revelation came weeks later, when a slave catcher returned empty-handed and frustrated. He told stories that didn't match the official narrative. That people along the roads had helped her, that strangers believed her without hesitation, that she spoke with certainty, not hysteria. She wasn't begging for sympathy. She was telling a story, and the details she shared were specific enough to be believed. That was when the true danger became clear. If her words reached the wrong ears, abolitionists, church leaders, officials, the plantation wouldn't just lose control, it would lose legitimacy. Reputation was everything, and reputation, once cracked, could never be fully repaired. Attempts were made to discredit her in advance. She was described as unstable, ungrateful, dangerous. But those claims rang hollow against the visible fear of those left behind. You could see it in how people flinched when her name was mentioned, how quickly conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Guilt has a presence. So does truth. What her escape did, more than anything else, was expose how fragile the system really was. It relied not just on chains and laws, but on denial, on the belief that no one would ever speak clearly enough, long enough, to be heard. By leaving, she turned every unspoken act of cruelty into a question that demanded an answer. And even though she was gone, her presence felt stronger than ever. Every closed door looked suspicious. Every raised voice felt like evidence. Every unexplained injury became a reminder. The plantation was no longer just a place of suffering. It was a place under quiet investigation, watched by its own conscience. They never found her, but they couldn't escape what followed. Because once hidden crimes are exposed, even indirectly, they don't need proof to exist. They only need memory. And her escape ensured that memory would never fully fade. Her return was not loud, and it was not rushed. That was what made it so terrifying. Months passed after her escape, and the plantation slowly convinced itself that the danger had passed. The rumors faded, the tension dulled, and people began to believe she had either been caught, killed, or vanished into the vast anonymity of the world beyond Virginia. They were wrong. Far away from the place that had broken her, she had learned something far more powerful than survival. She had learned patience. She understood that fear burned hot but briefly, while certainty destroyed slowly. And so she waited, watched, and planned. When she came back, she didn't return as the frightened girl who had fled barefoot into the night. She returned as someone unrecognizable. She used the invisibility she had mastered as a child, moving through spaces without drawing attention, listening more than speaking, allowing others to underestimate her. She didn't storm the plantation or announce herself. Instead, she let consequences arrive quietly, one by one, like a sickness no one could diagnose. The first signs felt like coincidence. An overseer known for his cruelty was found disgraced, accused of theft after records mysteriously surfaced showing missing funds. Another man, respected and feared, was exposed through whispered testimonies that reached the wrong ears at the wrong time. No one could trace the source, but the stories were too precise to dismiss. They contained names, dates, locations, details only someone who had lived through it could know. Panic set in quietly, behind closed doors. What made her revenge so devastating was that it didn't rely on violence. It relied on truth. She knew exactly which secrets would rot a person from the inside, which lies had been told too many times, which acts, if dragged into the light, would destroy reputations, marriages, inheritances. The people who had hurt her had built their power on the assumption that no one would ever speak clearly enough to be believed. She shattered that assumption. Letters began to circulate. Conversations reached the wrong pulpits. Certain men found doors closed to them that had once opened easily. Business partners withdrew. Allies distanced themselves. The plantation that had once seemed untouchable began to rot from within, not because of rebellion, but because of exposure. The system that had protected abuse turned inward, devouring itself. Those responsible sensed something was wrong long before they understood what it was. They felt watched. They felt hunted, not physically, but socially, legally, spiritually. The girl they thought they had erased had become something far more dangerous than a runaway. She had become a witness who knew how to speak in ways that could not be silenced. There were moments when they almost said her name out loud, almost admitted what they feared. But fear thrives on denial, And so they chose silence. They blamed outsiders. They blamed politics. They blamed the changing world. Anything except the truth, that the child they abused had returned, not in body, but in consequence. And that was the brilliance of it. She never needed to stand before them again. She never needed to raise her voice or her hand. Every loss they suffered, every door that closed, every night they lay awake wondering who knew what, that was her presence. That was her revenge. Not quick, not merciful, but exact. In the end, her return didn't look like justice in the way stories often promise. It looked like decay, like isolation, like power slipping quietly away. And for those who had once believed themselves untouchable, that slow unraveling was far worse than any punishment they could have imagined. Because she hadn't just escaped them, she had outlived their control. And in doing so, she had rewritten the ending they thought they owned. What followed next was something no one on the plantation, or in the surrounding county, could control. The consequences she set in motion didn't stop with those who had directly abused her. They spread outward, touching families, institutions, and authorities who had long benefited from silence. It was no longer just a personal reckoning. It became a chain reaction that exposed how deeply rot had settled into the system itself. Each revelation made the next inevitable, like dominoes falling in slow motion. As accusations surfaced and reputations collapsed, local officials were forced to intervene, not because they suddenly cared about justice, but because the damage had grown too visible to ignore. Courtrooms that once dismissed whispered claims were now filled with documented inconsistencies, missing records, and testimonies that contradicted years of official narratives. Plantation owners, who had been pillars of the community, found themselves questioned, not only about finances and conduct, but about the people they claimed to own. The questions were dangerous, and everyone knew it. What truly shocked authorities was not a single act of revenge, but the pattern. Every exposure was connected. Every downfall traced back, quietly, to the same plantation, the same households, the same circle of men who had believed their power was permanent. Investigators noticed it too late. By the time they tried to contain the damage, the story had already slipped beyond their reach, carried through letters, church meetings, and private conversations that refused to stay private. Fear spread among those who had once enforced order with whips and laws. Overseers fled to neighboring counties. Former allies turned on one another to protect themselves. Some tried to destroy records. Others attempted to rewrite history while it was actively collapsing around them. The irony was brutal. The same system that had erased enslaved voices for generations now collapsed under the weight of its own lies. The most unsettling part was that no one could point to her directly. There was no arrest to be made, no crime to prosecute. Everything that surfaced was technically true, backed by evidence, corroborated by multiple sources. Authorities couldn't punish truth without exposing themselves, and so they hesitated. That hesitation became paralysis. The chain reaction continued unchecked. Families who had lived comfortably on stolen labor suddenly faced financial ruin. Properties were seized. Marriages fractured under the pressure of public disgrace. Children inherited shame instead of land. Churches that had preached obedience were forced to answer for their role in protecting cruelty. Even those who had never laid a hand on her began to understand that benefiting from abuse carried its own cost. What made it unbearable for the powerful was the realization that this reckoning did not come from a mob or an uprising. It came from one girl who had been deemed powerless. Her revenge did not announce itself as vengeance. It disguised itself as consequence. That distinction mattered. It meant there was no enemy to fight, no rebellion to crush, no body to punish. There was only truth, spreading quietly, doing what violence could not. Officials attempted to draw a line, declaring the matter settled. But the damage refused to stop where they wanted it to. Too many people had seen too much. Too many questions had been asked. And once people begin questioning a system built on fear, that system weakens in ways it can never fully repair. The shock wasn't just legal or social, it was psychological. Slaveholders had always believed control was absolute. That belief had been the foundation of their power. Now it was gone. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that even the most abused person could become a force capable of dismantling everything they relied on. Not through strength, but through endurance. In the end, there was no dramatic finale, no public declaration of victory. Just a series of ruined lives among those who had once ruled unquestioned. The chain of revenge did exactly what it was meant to do. It made the system feel what it had inflicted for generations: instability, fear, and the constant awareness that the past is never truly buried. And that was what terrified authorities the most. Not that one enslaved girl had escaped, but that she had proven something far more dangerous. That survival itself could be weaponized, and that even the darkest systems carry the seeds of their own undoing. What remained after everything else faded was not her name, not her face, and not even a clear record of what she had endured. What survived was a shadow, a legacy that refused to disappear even after officials and families worked tirelessly to erase it. Plantation records were altered. Church logs were revised. Census entries mysteriously vanished. In some cases, entire pages were torn out and replaced with vague references that led nowhere. It was as if the system itself decided that forgetting her was the final act of control. But forgetting never works the way power imagines it will. People remembered her without meaning to. They remembered her through consequences. Through the empty houses that once rang with authority. Through the families that quietly relocated, carrying shame instead of pride. Through the sudden silence around certain surnames that had once dominated local politics and business. Her legacy did not survive as a story told openly. It survived as an absence that made people uncomfortable, as a gap in the narrative that could not be explained away. Among the formerly enslaved and their descendants, her memory took on a different shape. It was passed quietly, carefully, often without names or dates. A warning, a reassurance. Proof that suffering did not always end in silence. Elders spoke of a girl who refused to disappear the way she was supposed to. A girl who reminded them that endurance itself could be dangerous to those who relied on obedience. Over time, the details blurred, but the meaning sharpened. What made her legacy powerful was that it could not be claimed or controlled. No monument could contain it. No official account could redefine it. The people who tried to bury her story underestimated the way truth lingers, even when stripped of language. Children grew up sensing that something had happened, that certain topics were forbidden not because they were unimportant, but because they were too revealing. Silence, in this case, became evidence. Historians who later combed through Virginia's archives noticed inconsistencies that pointed back to her life. timelines that didn't align, sudden changes in ownership, legal disputes that referenced unnamed individuals but described events too specific to be coincidence. Each fragment alone meant little. Together, they formed the outline of a story someone had tried very hard to destroy. And the harder it had been suppressed, the louder it echoed. Her legacy also lived in fear, not among the oppressed, but among those who inherited power built on cruelty. Long after the people who had harmed her were gone, their descendants carried an unspoken anxiety. They knew, even if they didn't fully understand why, that their history rested on unstable ground, that what had been done in secrecy could one day surface again. That control was never as permanent as it appeared. What she ultimately left behind was not revenge as an event, but revenge as a transformation. She shifted the balance in ways that could not be reversed. She proved that erasure was not the same as defeat, that even when a system succeeds in removing a person from the record, it cannot remove the impact of what that person set in motion. That kind of legacy doesn't need recognition to exist. In the broader sweep of history, her story challenges the version of the past that insists power always wins. It complicates the narrative that enslaved people were only victims, stripped entirely of agency. Her life stands as a reminder that resistance does not always look like rebellion, and justice does not always arrive in recognizable forms. Sometimes it looks like survival stretched to its breaking point, then sharpened into something uncontainable. She was denied a voice, but she created an echo. She was denied protection, but she became a warning. She was denied humanity, but she exposed the inhumanity of everyone who believed they could own another life without consequence. That is why her story had to be buried. Not because it was rare, but because it was dangerous. It revealed a truth the system could not afford to admit, that even the most abused individual could alter the course of history simply by refusing to disappear. Today, we may never know her real name. We may never find a document that tells her story cleanly from beginning to end. But that absence is part of the legacy. It reminds us that history is not only what is written down, but what power tries and fails to erase. And in that failure, she endures. Because legacies like hers don't need statues or recognition. They live in the cracks of history, in the discomfort of unanswered questions, in the quiet understanding that some stories survive precisely because someone tried so hard to kill them.